For more than 7 decades, NATO has operated on a single premise: America will show up. Not just politically, but in force, through its troops stationed across Europe, its intelligence networks overhead, and its nuclear umbrella in the back. That promise turned the alliance into something more than a pact. It became a central pillar of the liberal order, tying together dozens of militaries into a single, integrated war-fighting machine. In doing so, NATO went on to become the most powerful and most successful military alliance in history. But that assumption is no longer as firm as it once was. In Washington, the strategic focus is shifting. It's moving toward Asia, where the rivalry with China is seen as more consequential, more demanding, and ultimately more pressing in the decades ahead. In that context, NATO is increasingly seen not as a cornerstone of American security, but as an outdated commitment that ties down resources and locks US power projection to a region that no longer holds strategic weight. Trump has been skeptical of NATO since taking office. So what happens if he follows through and America stops showing up? Today's video is sponsored by FreeCash. One thing I've noticed lately is how much idle time gets absorbed by the phone. Waiting for a flight, sitting in an Uber, or just switching off for a few minutes between work. But rather than just filling time with another scroll, I started using freecash.com. The concept is simple. You choose from a range of small activities, like playing mobile games, answering surveys, or testing apps, and once you complete them, you earn rewards in return. Those rewards can then be withdrawn through PayPal, gift cards, crypto, or other payout options upon a minimum of $25 earnings. It's simply a way to make your downtime slightly more useful. I tried a few of the game offers myself. You pick one, play for a bit, complete milestones, and the rewards build over time. Freecash.com also has thousands of available offers, so there's always something different depending on where you are and what's available in your region. And for people wondering whether it's legitimate, FreeCash has already paid out hundreds of millions of dollars to users worldwide, and it has strong ratings on Trustpilot. If you want to try it, you can use my link below or the QR code on screen. Signing up through it gives you a $10 bonus after completing your first offer. Suppose the United States, for whatever reason, steps away from NATO, the alliance wouldn't disappear overnight. Most, if not all, commitments remain in place. The institutions continue to function, and the member states are still there. On paper, NATO would survive, but in practice, something far more important breaks down. You see, NATO has been built around American capabilities that are not easily replaced. Take logistics as an example. Modern warfare depends on speed, the ability to move troops, equipment, and supplies across long distances in a matter of days. The United States carries most of that burden through its strategic airlift fleet with roughly 270 heavy aircraft, including C-17s and C-5s. By comparison, European allies collectively operate just over a dozen aircraft in that same class, with most of their capacity tied up in smaller A400M and C130 fleets. Europe can still deploy forces without the US, but not at the same scale or speed. Then there is intelligence. American satellites, surveillance aircraft, and reconnaissance systems provide a constant stream of data, tracking movements, identifying targets, and building a real-time picture of the battlefield. The Pentagon operates hundreds of military and intelligence satellites supported by a large fleet of surveillance aircraft, from AWACS to signals intelligence platforms and long-endurance drones. By comparison, Europeans rely on a handful of national satellite systems and a much smaller pool of surveillance aircraft, many of which are shared through NATO. To be clear, the capability is there, but it is limited and fragmented. If the American layer is removed, coordination across Europe becomes slower, less certain, and more dependent on national systems that were never designed to operate independently at that scale. Missile defense and long-range strike capabilities follow the same pattern. The US military can intercept incoming threats and strike deep into contested areas. Systems like Aegis and the B-2 make that possible. Those capabilities don't just add firepower, they shape the battlefield before it is even engaged. Without them, European militaries would have to operate closer to the threat, with fewer options and higher risks. And then there is the command structure itself. NATO's integration has always revolved around American leadership, planning, and coordination. It's not just about who gives the orders, but also about how those orders are executed through standardized procedures and shared platforms. Without the Pentagon at its center, Europe's command structure would no longer function in the same way. But NATO didn't just integrate armies, it made them dependent on each other, and above all, dependent on the United States. That dependence is best visible in the hardware. Many European militaries are built around American platforms, from fighter jets to missile systems. The F-35, for instance, is not just an aircraft. It is part of a larger ecosystem that connects sensors, communications, and targeting across multiple countries. That level of integration brings enormous advantages, but it also creates reliance. If the United States steps back, maintaining that ecosystem becomes more complicated for all sorts of technical and political reasons. However, none of that means Europe is defenseless. Far from it. European NATO members collectively field capable militaries with advanced technology and significant resources. The problem is that those capabilities are not structured to operate entirely on their own. So, while NATO as an organization wouldn't necessarily collapse with America's exit, it would no doubt face an unprecedented crisis. Article 5, NATO's core commitment, would become the focal point of the alliance's uncertainty. It wouldn't disappear, but its credibility would come under question. Responses would become less predictable, more conditional, and increasingly shaped by the political will of individual European states. And that uncertainty would have compounding ramifications. Deterrence depends as much on perception as it does on capability. If adversaries begin to question Article 5 and whether NATO will respond as a unified force, the threshold for testing that assumption lowers. Not through full-scale war, but through smaller, calculated moves, probing for cracks in the armor. Think of gray zone tactics, cyber operations, political interference, limited military actions, and so on. In every measurable way, Europe would have to reinvent its military posture in the air, on land, at sea, and in space. Strategic airlift would need to be expanded, and intelligence networks would have to be strengthened, including satellites and surveillance systems. Missile defense would need to be scaled up, along with long-range strike capabilities that can operate without American support. A study by the International Institute for Strategic Studies puts a price tag on that gap. Europe would need to spend roughly $1 trillion over the next 25 years just to replace the conventional capabilities currently provided by the United States. That includes around 400 additional fighter jets, 600 main battle tanks, 20 destroyers, and 10 nuclear-powered attack submarines, along with dozens of missile systems, helicopters, and AWACS aircraft. Beyond hardware, Europe would also need to build out a new command structure to tie everything together. However, Europe's industrial base is not built for that kind of rapid expansion. Production lines are limited, naval shipyards have shrunk, and political will is lacking. Land systems could be scaled up within a decade, but the air and naval sectors, where American capabilities dominate, are far harder to replace. France and Turkey stand out as partial exceptions. The French are working to increase annual Rafale fighter jet production to around 30 by the end of the decade. Meanwhile, Turkey is currently building around 50 naval vessels simultaneously, including frigates, corvettes, submarines, and amphibious ships. But besides those two, few countries in Europe have the industrial base to scale production quickly. And even then, that $1 trillion estimate covers only conventional forces and represents the bare minimum needed to defend Europe itself. It wouldn't give Europe the kind of global reach the United States has, nor the ability to conduct sustained offensive operations beyond its own region. Technically, Europe has the economic capacity to make that investment. Its combined GDP rivals that of the United States, and it has resources needed if governments decide to follow through. The real problem, however, is time. Replacing the removed American capabilities would take decades, and during that time, Europe would be exposed and vulnerable to coercion. In geopolitics, those who can't defend themselves get picked apart. For all the focus on what the United States brings to the alliance, Europe brings something just as important: geography. Access to that geography is what allows American power to extend beyond its own borders. Across the continent, the Pentagon maintains a network of more than 40 military bases, along with logistics hubs and pre-positioned equipment. Those are not just forward deployments aimed at Russia. They are staging grounds for operations into the Middle East, North Africa, the Sahel, the Arctic, and Russia's western border. Remove Europe from the equation and America's reach becomes more limited, more distant, and more expensive to maintain. No amount of aircraft carriers can replace an entire continent. Without its bases in Europe, America would be projecting power across two oceans, thousands of kilometers from any major conflict zone. Then there is the political layer. NATO has always provided the United States with something few other alliances can: political legitimacy. When Washington acts alongside NATO members, it doesn't appear to be a unilateral move. It looks like an international response with diplomatic weight that shapes how actions are perceived and how they are resisted. So, without Europe, America would lose not only allies, but also political cover. Finally, there is the defense market. Europe may rely on US capabilities, but it is also the largest and most consistent market for American weapons. Over the past decade, roughly a third of US arms exports went to Europe, but since 2022, that share has grown even further. Poland, Germany, the Netherlands, and others have placed large orders for systems like F-35 jets, Patriot missiles, and HIMARS. The F-35 program alone involves more than a dozen European countries, with hundreds of aircraft, either ordered or planned, locking them into decades of maintenance, upgrades, and integration with US systems. Those acquisitions are not just commercial deals. They sustain a significant portion of the US defense industrial base and reinforce long-term dependency. Without Europe, American defense giants such as Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing would lose their biggest export market overnight. Yet even taking all of that into account, and the mutual dependence between them, it is Europe that stands to lose the most from an American exit. The most profound issue would be political coordination. There are two ways it could go down. Most likely, NATO's decision-making could splinter along national lines, with members beginning to hedge. Instead of relying on a single overarching framework, they could build multiple layers of regional pacts. Western Europe, led by France and Germany, could push for a more centralized approach and attempt to restore the continent's military-industrial base. But that concept wouldn't fully align with the priorities of Eastern Europe. Poland and the Baltic states operate under a different timeline. For them, the threat is urgent, and so they would focus on quick results rather than long-term integration projects. Either way, as countries assume greater responsibility for their own defense, coordination would become more difficult. Over time, European security would shift away from a single unified structure toward a mosaic of smaller alliances. Alternatively, suppose Europe adapts and finds a way to overcome its internal disagreements. Somehow, some way, unity is preserved, and in the decades following, Europe not only restores its capabilities, but undergoes structural change in the process. Defense spending, which had long been debated and delayed, becomes a baseline requirement. Industrial production scales up, not in response to a crisis, but as a permanent feature of policy. The new NATO that emerges rebuilds its command structure under European control, but that shift in power carries profound consequences. For decades, Europe's passive military posture was not just a weakness, it was intentional. The United States carried the burden of defense, but in doing so, it also retained control over the course of the alliance. By assuming all security decisions, America discouraged nearly every major world power in history from restoring independent military postures. Dependence made it easier to keep allies in line. A Europe that relied on American protection had limited room to do otherwise. And so, with the exception of Russia, Europe's instinct to compete gradually wore away. Its geopolitics effectively froze. In and of itself, that is the art of NATO. However, that subjugated arrangement would not survive an American exit. The moment Europe is forced to defend itself, it also gains the ability to act on its own terms. That wouldn't be noticeable right away, but within 40 to 50 years of America's exit, Europe could very well emerge as a power center in its own right. And once that happens, the geopolitical clock would turn back to a time when relations between Western countries were conditional, negotiated, and at times contested. Altogether, stepping away from NATO would certainly reduce America's commitments, free up resources, and shift its focus elsewhere. In the short term, that works, but down the line, it would come at an irreparable price. Skipping the bill often comes at the cost of credibility. Remember, if you want to try free cash, the link is in the description. You'll get a $10 bonus after completing your first offer. I've been your host Shervan from CaspianReport. If you enjoy these videos, consider supporting the channel on Patreon and click the bell icon so the next one doesn't slip past you. Thank you for your time and Saul.